Funding for the Hinckley Report is made possible in part by the Cleone Peterson Eccles Endowment Fund.
Tonight on the Hinckley Report, President Trump's new immigration plan could deport millions.
The new order is going to be very much tailored to what I consider to be a very bad decision, but we can tailor the order to that decision and get just about everything, in some ways more.
How will this affect local residents and businesses? Protests against Trump continue. Is anyone listening? The Utah State Legislature enters its final weeks with an unexpected budget increase. Legislators grapple with divisive topics. Will we see changes in tax law, public lands, or education policy? And what measures will our leaders take to resolve the state's growing opioid addiction problem? Good evening, and welcome to the Hinckley Report. I'm Jason Perry, Director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics. Covering the week, we have Spencer Cox, Lieutenant Governor of the state of Utah, Natalie Gochner, Director of the Kim C. Gardner Policy Institute, and Lisa Riley Roche, reporter with the Deseret News. Thank you so much for being with us tonight. A lot of things happening nationally. I want to start with an issue that directs us kind of an interesting level, really, on the Republican conundrum. And we're seeing protests across the country. We're seeing it here in Utah at our Capitol building. And really the question that's starting to emerge is, what is the responsibility of a faithful member of the GOP to a president that everyone is not really rallying behind? Lieutenant Governor, you've been in this position where you haven't really been behind President Trump from the very beginning. How are you balancing this relationship?
Well, it is a balancing act for sure, and the Hamilton musical, where it says that winning is easy and governing is harder, right? We're seeing a little bit of that, and I think that the difficulty that we're facing right now is it looks like the Democrats just handed their angry talking points to the Republicans, and the Republicans handed their angry talking points to the Democrats, and they just flipped sides, and a lot of voters in the middle are saying, wait, this is just pure partisan politics. If you were against executive action before, why aren't you against executive action now, and vice versa? And so the question is, can we stand on principle? Of course, we want the president to be successful. We want to see Congress be successful. We want changes, but we have to convince the public that these changes are the right thing for them, and not just be against things.
So who's the we you're talking about, if there's a little bit of a difficulty?
Well, yeah, when I say we, I'm talking about the Republican Party. Again, as a member of the Republican Party and someone that believes in these ideals, it's still important, and we can't ignore what's happening out there. It's easy to just paint these protests as, oh, that's nobody, it really doesn't matter. But I got to tell you, there's something happening out there, and if we don't pay attention to it, if we're not careful, it could really come back to hurt us in the next election.
Well, let's talk about that. And Natalie, if you'll take just a second on this, because the potential hurting the Republican Party. Who is showing up at these protests? Is this a party action? And what do you think the implications are?
Well, I mean, people are debating this, but it's very clear that Utahns were there and that people in Congressman Chaffetz's district were there, protesting. And I get it. I mean, when I hear you speak, Lieutenant Governor, I worked for 3 Republican governors. I worked for a Republican president as an appointee. I worked for a Republican congressman. I mean, I'm a registered Republican, and I find myself dizzy by what's going on. Sometimes I like things, sometimes I hate things. And I just find myself going back and forth. So I look at those protesters, and I'm sure there's a lot to be angry about. But there's also, let's just be really clear, I mean, if we could get some regulatory reform, if we could reduce corporate income taxes in this country, I mean, there's Republican things that I'm very excited about.
So
it is a conundrum.
It is. So if you had those things happen, some of those reforms you just mentioned and some of the base of the party have been talking about, do you or maybe generally in Utah, do people start saying, okay, I'm okay with President Trump? I wasn't really before. You weren't one that was in his camp before either. Do you start feeling okay about that presidency?
Yeah. Well, for me, this is a really easy thing because I'm not a fan of President Trump's character. And I don't think he's a good example to people like my children. And so I'm doing my best to keep an open mind, but I have real trouble with the personality in the executive office right now.
Go ahead, Lisa.
Was that direct enough?
That's
that was pretty good.
But that seems to be the issue the Republicans are facing, right? Because I think a lot of, not just other Republicans in office, but a lot of rank and file Republicans and the independents that tend to vote conservative feel exactly as you've described. And so the question now is, how do Republicans in office respond if you want to stay in office?
And that is the question. So do we hold town halls? Do we listen to people when there is a lot of anger out there showing up? And the thing that worries me is, long term, we have an entire generation. If you spend any time with millennials right now, you realize that they don't like the two parties, either party really, and the opportunity to lose that generation is really scary. And we think that history isn't going to change. You know, the Republicans have a supermajority here in the state of Utah. That's never going to change. And but if you do study history, you realize that nothing is forever. And we have to listen to those voices, understand why they're upset, what that angst is, and respond in a way that shows them that we do care about them as well, and that our policies, the things we're trying to accomplish, will benefit them in the long run.
Go ahead, Lisa.
I was going to say, I think it's easy to forget that we went through this once before with the Tea Party, and that was an internal issue with conservatives, correct? A wing of the party felt like they weren't being listened to, got angry, mobilized, got out, got in the faces of their representatives, and we saw changes here in Utah and other places around the country. So now we're seeing that same angst, and I think it's easy for Republicans here to say, oh, these are just Democrats. I mean, we've heard some of our own members of Congress suggest they were paid, they weren't local, they weren't really constituents. Well, I've talked to a lot of these people. I've seen a lot of these people turn up at the Capitol. They contacted me after the town halls to let me know, yes, here's my address, here's who I am,
right?
And I want to be heard.
Jason, I think that it's really important too to think about what's happened in Salt Lake County. So Salt Lake County has about 1 in every 2 Utahns in the county. And redistricting has split up this county in so many ways that if you are a Democrat in Salt Lake County, if you're a progressive in Salt Lake County, if you're a moderate in Salt Lake County, you've kind of been sliced up and you don't feel like you have a voice in Congress. I'd love to hear you comment on that, Lieutenant Governor, because I think that if you're someone in Salt Lake County who doesn't think like the current Utah congressional delegation, where do you go? I think you go to these protests and get upset.
Well, and I think it's even deeper than that. You look, you know, the governor lost by 10 points in the convention, right? In the Republican convention, loses by 10 points, and then wins in a closed Republican primary by 44 points. I think that shows some of the divide just within the party. And this angst I'm hearing, isn't just from Democrats. I'm hearing it from Republicans too, lifelong Republicans who are saying, I'm not sure this is my party anymore. And not just the national party, but the state party as well, and some of the divisions that we've seen there. I have a brother-in-law who said, I'm out of the party just last week. I hear that every week.
A lot of people taking a pause.
They're just not happy with the direction of the people putting party ahead of a country, people putting party ahead of... Look, I think party should be about 45th on your list of things that you should put first. I mean, God, family, country, your high school basketball team. I think all of those things should be ahead of party, and that we need to make sure that our principles and caring about people are what stand out, and that's not happening.
It's interesting to see, we're talking about the Republican side right now, but the Democrats are meeting tomorrow to elect a new chair for the Democratic National Committee, and they're talking about their future, right? They're talking about 2018. Where do they go? It sounds like the Republicans aren't exactly... they don't have that figured out completely either, right?
Well, this is the problem with partisan politics. It's why we have low voter turnout, not just in our state, but in our country. People are tired of the parts. There's a lesson that we all should have learned from Donald Trump, and it's the lesson that nobody learned. And it's the lesson of authenticity. Whether you like him or you hate him, we kept waiting for that pivot to happen, and he didn't pivot. Pivot is a purely partisan political term, and that is that I'm not authentic. I'm going to say whatever it takes to get me elected, and then I'm going to say whatever it takes to get whatever I need done. And that's the idea of switching talking points. The Republicans now sound like the Democrats just a few months ago, and vice versa. And I think people in this country are absolutely sick and tired of it.
Interesting. So, Natalie, you've advised many people. If you were advising the Democrats, maybe in Utah or nationally, how do they capitalize on some of this discord we've been talking about?
Yeah. Well, I don't think they'd like my advice, but I mean, if I were talking to the Democrats in Utah, I would encourage them to to move to the center more. Right? I would try to get away from the extreme left, and I would try to move into the productive middle where real problems get solved, and see if you can't break into Republican territory there, because there's a lot of Republicans that are frustrated and alienated from their party. And as long as both parties go to their extremes, there's this huge something to get in the middle. And so a lieutenant governor may not like me mentioning this, but he's a very productive middle guy. So, you know, if he's moving to the middle and the Democrats are moving to the middle, it could be really interesting.
Maybe middle, or maybe more pragmatic, right? I mean, isn't that what we always say about governing? Governors especially, you have to get things done. It's not like other elected offices. And how do you get things done? You move to the middle, you compromise, you find common ground, and you move forward. And that's what we're not seeing nationally. And I think you're right. The parties need to figure out how to get to that middle. The real fight, though, is going to be, to your point earlier, redistricting. That's going to be coming up in the not too distant future, and the key, I think, for Democrats here and nationally, and Republicans who want to see changes in their party, are going to be to get folks elected, to get involved in that process, and make sure that there's adequate representation for all voices in Congress and in state houses.
Well, I was just going to add, let's talk about outdoor retailers for just a second. I realize it's not Trump conundrum, but think of what happened here. Well, think of what happened here. Yeah, think of what happened here. You know, it was a failure for our state, and both the Outdoor Retail Association and our Republican leaders kind of overreached in a way that created a bad discussion. And I only bring it up in this context because if you're Democrats in this state, you should go figure out to try how to put this deal back together. Now, you had a real intense personal experience with this, but if I was advising the Democrats, I'd say go talk to the leaders of those companies and start making the case that you got to at least keep open the notion of us bidding again for that convention.
Well,
give us another chance. We can put this back together.
This idea
Somebody's got to do that.
Of being practical, and I think that's really important when it comes to governing. And the issue is, for Democrats, I'll say this, there's a tendency to overreact to everything that's happening and push them further to the extremes. And that's what we're seeing in our country. The divide grows. Instead of people coming together to fix problems, which I feel that's what leadership is about, is the practical. What's the problem? How do we fix it? And can I square that with my principles? They tend to go the other side. And that's where these protesters there may be, if they're not careful, they may overplay their hand a little bit. When you show up just yelling and screaming, then you engender sympathy for the other side. That doesn't get your message across. That doesn't help anything, and it's not constructive.
But that's what we're seeing from the White House on the Republican side, right? Is just a very loud, very aggressive voice telling us what we're going to do and how everything's going to be the greatest, and pushing to certain positions. That's the problem for the Republican side, right?
Which is why this election, I think, has challenged all of our deeply held wisdom on elections and how we govern and all of those things.
Mm-hmm. Let's talk about one of those issues that has been challenging the Utah experience, and they are issues on immigration. And there have been some things happening in Washington, D.C. through President Trump on what's happening with immigrants, and some from deportation to other kinds of arrests in the country. Utah started with what they call the Utah Compact. Natalie, you worked on this to some extent. Is it incongruent, the Utah Compact, with what's happening nationally?
Oh, certainly is. So the Utah Compact was 5 principles to guide the immigration discussion in Utah, and it talked about keeping families together and supporting our economy, and making sure that law-abiding people are taken care of, but those who break the law are taken away from us. And it's a model for how to approach this discussion. And instead, what we see happening in Washington is this very mean-spirited, we're going to come after you. And can you imagine what it feels like to be a dreamer right now in this country, or to be someone who's been in the shadows and been contributing to our economy and doing things? I was in Mexico City over the holidays, and I hung my head a little lower as an American. just because of the mean-spiritedness that's happening towards this very important country to the south of us. You have a lot of experience in Mexico, Spencer.
Yeah, I actually lived there for 2 years as a missionary, so it's fascinating,
sad, right?
And it's interesting. What's fascinating to me about this discussion is that President Obama deported more illegal immigrants than any president in history, and we don't talk about that. We had huge crackdowns here in the state of Utah during the Obama presidency, and so much of it has to do with kind of tone and the brashness and language, and I think that the way you talked about that, and I was down to the border just recently, took a tour of the border, looked at what places where we do have a border wall and a border fence, and watched live video of people getting over that fence, that wall. You know, 30-foot wall, you get a 31-foot ladder, and you can still make it over. You know, and so the problem I believe and I feel strongly about is that legal immigration needs to be fixed. It's a disaster right now. It's almost impossible unless you're very wealthy or very well connected to legally immigrate. And we do have, this is, again, the data is clear. We have net out migration right now in the United States and have had for several years. So it isn't the same problem with Mexico. With Mexico, we have more immigrants leaving than are coming. And so I think it's important to get all the data, to get all the facts, and to understand what works and what doesn't, and we have to fix legal immigration.
Jason, may I just say one thing about the wall, just to kind of get people thinking about the substance of this? You say ladders, there's also tunnels, there's also boats, but even more important is we know from our data that about 45% of the people in this country that are here illegally came here legally. 45%, right? They came here with a visa and then overstayed the visa. So the wall is just this, this kind of illusion that it's going to solve the problem, and it really is at best a half-truth.
Mm-hmm. Lisa, you've been reporting on some of these issues in the state. How are Utahns reacting to kind of the ban coming from Washington, D.C. and the direct impacts on the street with our law enforcement and otherwise?
Well, I saw one of my colleagues covered an event last night up in Summit County. There's a lot of concern there because of some ICE actions against some immigrants here illegally. The Summit County Sheriff told a big audience that no, we're not going to allow our deputies to be deputized to enforce federal immigration law. We want people to come forward if there's some kind of an issue in their home or in their community. We want them to be witnesses to crimes. We want them to come forward if there's domestic violence in their home or other issues. There's just this incredible ripple effect on these communities. And I know most people think Park City is this very wealthy, very elite area where a lot of people come and enjoy themselves or have big houses. But there's a whole community of people there serving that tourism industry. And a lot of them are from Spanish-speaking countries. And what their status is, who knows? But they're very much a part of making Park City work and making the larger tourism industry in the state work. So what's going to happen if indeed this is enforced to that extent?
That's why they're taking a stand that they are.
Jason,
that's very good.
Spencer mentions, we need legal immigration. There is no question in the Utah economy right now that we have a labor shortage in hourly jobs and in high-skilled jobs. Okay, we have an unemployment rate under 4%, but in our resort industry, our tourism industry, our construction industry, our landscaping industry, all these hourly jobs, we have a labor shortage. And then our tech jobs, whether it's software engineers, whatever, again, we have a labor shortage, and it's immigrants that fill those jobs. And so when we put up all these barriers to having those people here, we actually contract our economy. And if we fill those jobs where there's shortages, all the jobs in the middle expand. So I think the economic data and theory is very clear on how important a very productive immigration policy is for our economy and our country.
Very good. Can we turn to our legislative session? Sadly, we only have a short amount of time left.
You may be the only person that's sad about that.
Tongue in cheek, I say it. Let's get to a couple things that are still on the table. Let's start with tax reform. We're starting to see a suite of tax reforms coming out. It's kind of late in the session, but aimed at building up this tax base in some way. Let's start with you, Lisa, for just a second. And as the economist, you can respond on that, and then the political side of it. Let's just hit this for just a moment.
Well, what we have is a GOP leadership response to the initiative, Our Schools Now, that would raise income taxes to bring in more money for schools. The GOP leadership met privately in the House and Senate and came up with this package of proposals that would restore the full sales tax on food, lower the sales tax rate, and also change the threshold at which you no longer receive exemptions on your state income taxes, lower that, and then lower that rate as well. They put that package together behind closed doors. They went to their caucuses behind closed doors. We haven't seen any kind of bill draft. In fact, they're running into some trouble with the income tax side, and I'm sure our economists can explain what that is, because it sounded very complicated to me. And that's part of the problem with trying to put together policy, I think, on the fly, which seems to be what this is. I think the motives are good. They talk about broadening the base, lowering the rate. You eventually bring in more money to the state, and the pain is spread a little more evenly. But there are a lot of advocates, especially for low-income Utahns, that feel that adversely targets them, that restoring sales tax on food. I don't think we've heard the governor's office comment on this yet, that package. Have you taken a look at that?
Well,
Are you on board?
We saw it about the same time you guys did. So the governor has talked about the importance of re-looking at our entire tax structure. I think it was 2007 the last time we had any type of major tax reform. And what's happened over time is somebody will come up with a really good reason and a good lobbyist and get an exemption for their group of people. And I think we have 86 of those now that have kind of gotten in over time, and that's put pressure to raise taxes, because there's all these one-off exemptions now. And this is a very conservative idea of lowering the rate and broadening the base. It's something the governor believes in. He mentioned it in his State of the State address. We assumed that this would be something we'd be working on over the next year and coming back at the next session. So we were a little surprised when we were approached by leadership in the legislature saying, hey, we want to move forward on this. So we're now meeting with our economists and kind of working through that process as well, trying to digest, one, what exactly is going to be proposed, because it keeps changing, and two, what will be the impact on every group of people here in the state of Utah.
Okay.
This is such a wonky topic, and I don't want to make it wonkier.
Okay, I'm sure you can do it.
Well, I'll just say this. There is clear evidence that our tax system is not keeping pace with our economy. In other words, we have a tax system that was designed at a time when we had a very different economy. And so we have all these needs as a growing state, and the revenues aren't coming in. Look at what's happening in our school system, the need for more revenue, and so significant that business leaders are actually asking for a $750 million tax increase on the income tax side. But one point I want to make, Jason, is that the sales tax on food, I think, was taking that rate to a lower rate, I think, was ill-advised. It was done to help low-income Utahns, but we gave everybody in the state that tax break. So its purpose was targeted to low income, but we gave everybody that break. And by doing so, we cut our revenues, we took away some, we added instability to our tax system. And I think it would be much better to tax food the same as everything else, and then find other ways to help low income Utahns, like an earned income tax credit or some other targeted needs. As it is, we made more volatility in our system, cut revenue, and didn't really surgically attack what we were trying to do.
And Natalie
Can you
brings
tell
up
I'm a policy wonk? I mean, because I'm like, if you want to help low-income people, then go help low-income people. Don't go do this big, broad cut that causes you unintended consequences.
Yeah, and that was especially felt in rural Utah. So if you buy a car and you live in rural Utah, a lot of the times you're coming to Provo or Salt Lake or Ogden to buy that car, right? And so the sales tax stays there. The only thing that people are buying in many of our small rural Utah towns is food. That's, and so it really hurt the tax base in rural Utah, something I think people hadn't thought about. Yeah. And that's the question: is there a better way to do it so we don't have the volatility? Yeah. And the way we purchase things has changed. Online sales tax is a big issue right now, because for the last month, for the first time in the history of our country, we bought more things online than we did in stores.
Very interesting. Can we spend our last couple of minutes on opioid overdose? And in Utah. We've been talking about this a lot. We even have some bills in the legislature. Natalie, been following this a little bit too. Explain this issue and why our legislature is trying to grapple with it.
Yeah. Well, I don't think you can find somebody in this state who doesn't have a loved one or knows someone who has a loved one that's been impacted by the opioid problem. It is a scourge on our society, and it's a real challenge, and I applaud our legislature for trying to get around it. I write a column in the Deseret News, and I wrote something about how people can handle the pain, they can't handle the opioids. Mm-hmm. And I got a 2.5-page letter from a gentleman just telling me about his story with his son, and I think this is something that needs public policy. So
yeah,
I'll say that as the introduction.
She's right. It absolutely is, and we're seeing the growth, the explosive growth in opioid addictions and everything associated with that.
Socioeconomic sectors.
That's right.
Yeah.
And for the first time, I think from a public health standpoint, it's very interesting. We're actually seeing the life expectancy of middle-class white America start to drop. Now, that's never happened. We're getting healthier across the world.
This is very true.
But when you look at it, the reasons are suicide, opioid addictions. I mean, those are the two major reasons. And that scourge, it's not just here in the state of Utah, it's everywhere in the country. And there were several bills that were passed last session. We're looking at more this session. Part of it has to do with education. Part of it has to do with enforcement. But there are a lot of things we've got to do. And I think we're reaching that tipping point where society in general is starting to recognize, okay, this is an epidemic. It's not just a one-off.
Last comment, Lisa.
I was going to say it certainly ties in the discussion about the use of medical marijuana, legalizing the use of medical marijuana as an alternative to opioids. And it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out in that discussion.
Great point.
Sadly, that's where we're going to have to leave it. We're watching this bill and the others in this legislative session very closely. Thank you so much for the great discussion tonight. That's it for the Hinckley Report. We will continue our conversation online. Go to kued.org/Hinckley Report for more of our panel discussion. Thank you for joining us. Good night.